Welcome. I'm Joe Mendel. This is America's Presidents in Bits and Pieces, Part 1. Just a few interesting facts about some of the presidents of the United States. This will take us up until the Civil War. Part 2 will take the middle portion, and Part 3 will bring you up into the 20th century. So, enjoy. General George Washington, the first of our military general presidents. He had no middle name. His name was just George. He had horrible dental problems when he was a young man. As a result, he had 4 sets of wooden dentures. You won't see any pictures of Mr. Washington smiling. The ceremonial dentures were made of rhino and elephant tusks, and they were fitted with gold springs. Gold springs, I hear you ask? Yes, of course. When Mr. Washington opened his mouth, he didn't want his dentures to remain clenched, so the gold springs opened his teeth for him. He was one of the founding fathers, along with Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, James Monroe, James Madison, and others. He was a slave owner, as many of the early presidents were. When he was elected president, he did not govern from the White House. There was no White House until 1800, so he governed from New York. He's one of the faces that's carved on Mount Rushmore. When he was elected, there were only 11 states. You've heard of the 13 original colonies, yes, but when he was elected, there were only 11 of those colonies that had been confirmed as states. 2 others followed very shortly. He established the cabinet. He recognized that the president would need advice on various aspects of the government and the country to enable him to govern more effectively. He created the term Mr. President, which is how you address the President of the United States. Has been rumored that if you don't address him as Mr. President, that it could be considered a treasonous act, but that's never been proven one way or the other. He added the phrase, "So help me God," to the oath of office that the president takes. He delivered the first State of the Union address. That is, when the president goes and tells the nation how the country is doing, what he sees in his plans for the rest of his presidency. He was... I did all that. Okay, we'll have to cut that out. Here we have John Adams, the first of our father and son presidential pairs. Mr. Adams did govern from the White House. The White House was opened in 1800, so he served the last of his term in the new White House. His son became the 6th president of the United States. It's been a sort of tradition that the president or one of the president's family members might have a pet in the White House, usually a dog. Mr. Adams had a dog in the White House, which he named Satan. Interesting fact about Mr. Adams was that he died on the 15th anniversary of the adoption of the Declaration of Independence, and that was the same day that Thomas Jefferson died. Here we have Thomas Jefferson. He was the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. He was a slave owner, as I said, a lot of the early presidents were. He was involved in the first disputed presidential election. 36 ballots of the Electoral College wound up in a tie. They couldn't differentiate between Mr. Jefferson and his opponent, Mr. Aaron Burr. So in the end, Congress decided that Mr. Jefferson was the lesser of 2 evils, and they made him President of the United States. Even though he was a slave owner, he did sign a law prohibiting the importation of new slaves from 1807. He established the concept of states' rights. That is, there is a federal government, but there are also state governments, and those states had issues to deal with that were within the state boundaries. And as long as they were within the state boundaries, the federal government had no responsibility. Because he had a bad stutter, he delivered a written State of the Address to Congress. and that remained the situation until later when we'll see it change back to an oral presentation. He is one of the faces carved on Mount Rushmore, and he was a very astute and successful lawyer. A lot of people came to Mr. Jefferson to get law advice. If you're doing some traveling and you happen to be in the Washington area, you should probably go and visit Mr. Jefferson's house, which is called Monticello. It's a very interesting place to see. To me, it was interesting because he has two rather interesting clocks. One is a pendulum clock, which the weights of which are running down the side of the doorway, and it's labeled Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and the weights go down in the basement on Sunday, and the clock doesn't work. You don't work on Sunday in the United States. The other clock is a large outdoor clock up over the portico over the front door, but it only has an hour hand, and people said, why do you only have an hour hand on that clock? And Mr. Jefferson was quoted as saying, when you're in God's nature, you don't need to have the time any more accurate than that. Here we have James Madison, the first president not to have a vice president. It's not because there weren't any vice presidents, it's just because his vice presidents kept dying. His first vice president, George Clinton, died during his first term in office. During his second term in office, his vice president, Eldridge Berry, died. So the moral of the story is, don't be a vice president under Mr. Madison. Mr. Madison was one of the primary authors, along with Mr. Jefferson, of the Constitution of the United States, and Mr. Madison is credited with being the father of the Bill of Rights, which was appended to the Constitution. And he remained very good friends with Thomas Jefferson after he left office. Here we have James Monroe, the last of our founding fathers' presidents. He bought Florida from Spain, which gave the people of New York a place to go during the winter. He studied law under Mr. Jefferson, and he signed an act which created the Second United States National Bank, which was used to fund the War of 1812 against Britain. This is John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, the second president. He was a man very strongly against slavery. Mr. Adams, John Quincy Adams, wrote some very extensive diaries covering the period from 1779 to 1848. It spanned more than 50 volumes and is considered still today a very valuable historical resource. Mr. Adams was considered one of the better diplomatic presidents that we ever had. He drafted the concept of the Monroe Doctrine. It wasn't passed into law yet, but it basically said, we are the United States, don't invade our boundaries because you might suffer the consequences. Mr. Adams was a devout skinny dipper. This is Andrew Jackson, the second of our military general presidents. Credited with founding the spoils system, well, maybe, but basically it works in government that if you want to get something from someone and they needed something else, you could get that, and then that would be, and you would be recognized for what you've done and perhaps be given a reward or whatever. That was the spoils system. Mr. Jackson was involved in over 100 duels, and he was wounded many times in those duels, and he actually killed a man in one of those duels. He dealt with the first signs of the split of the Union. Basically, the government shot itself in the foot by imposing very heavy tax on the goods that the southern states produced, and also on some of the raw materials that the southern states used to produce their goods. And of course, this upset the southern states to the extent that South Carolina threatened to secede from the Union, and Mr. Jackson threatened military force against South Carolina if they seceded, and they didn't secede. Here is Martin Van Buren. Mr. Van Buren's economic policies led to the being blamed for the first Great Depression of 1837. Therefore, he picked up the nickname Martin Can Ruin. William Henry Harrison served the shortest term of any president, 31 days in office. He died, unfortunately, of typhoid fever. He was the last president to be born as a British subject, and he was the oldest president. He was 68 years old at inauguration until Mr. Reagan came along, who was 69 years old, and Mr. Trump, who was 71 years old at his inauguration. And the last president in this part one of the presidents is John Tyler. Now, he was the first president to be succeeding into the presidency. Mr. Harrison had died, and so Mr. Tyler moved up. There was nothing in law about how the succession was to take place, but everybody said, well, you're the vice president, you're the man to move up. And it was later established in law as to what the succession procession, that's a bit of a tongue twister, isn't it, was to be. We'll go into that a little bit later on. Mr. Tyler was the longest serving president not elected to office. He was the first president to have a veto overridden by Congress. He was a strong Southern sympathizer, and he was elected to the Confederate House of Representatives after he left office of the presidency. He did father 15 children. That's more than any other president that we know of. Obviously, they didn't have Netflix in those days. So that's the end of part one. I hope you've enjoyed that, and it spurs you on to have a look at part two.